My sister invited 200 guests to her wedding. She assigned me a plastic folding chair in the hallway next to the public restrooms, while distant cousins sat in the VIP section. I did not make a scene. I simply left. 10 minutes later, my sister stopped her own ceremony in tears because nobody had bothered to ask who I actually was to that venue. My name is Cassidy, and I am 33 years old. Before I tell you exactly how I ruined the most expensive day of her life legally, and completely let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic family member a lesson they will never forget. For the past decade, I have been the designated black sheep of my family. While my parents paraded my younger sister Brittany around as their golden child, I quietly built a commercial real estate empire from the ground up. I learned early on that silence was my greatest weapon, so I kept my wealth entirely hidden from them. They thought I was just a struggling mid-level office worker barely making ends meet. The sweeping iron gates of Oakhaven Estate gleamed under the late afternoon sun as I pulled my Range Rover into the valet circle. The Tudor-style mansion sat on 40 acres of manicured gardens in upstate New York. It boasted a grand ballroom, imported Italian marble floors, and crystal chandeliers that cost more than the average American home. I knew the exact cost of those chandeliers. I knew the exact square footage of the ballroom. I knew it all because through a blind corporate holding company, I owned every single brick of this estate. But today, I was not the owner. Today, I was just the sister of the bride. I stepped out of my car and smoothed down the skirt of my navy blue silk dress. It was an elegant, understated piece that had set me back $2,000. I carried a silver-wrapped gift box containing custom crystal champagne flutes. I had kept my distance from the wedding planning for the past 6 months, enduring Brittany and her endless demands. I also endured my parents and their constant subtle digs about my single status and my boring career. I tolerated it all, biting my tongue to maintain family peace. I walked up the grand stone steps and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The foyer was buzzing with caterers, florists, and elegantly dressed early arrivals. A young man with a clipboard stepped into my path. "Welcome to Oakhaven," he said with a practiced, polite smile. "Name, please." I told him my name and that I was the sister of the bride. The host dragged his finger down the VIP column of his clipboard. He frowned, flipped the page, and scanned the general admission list. His brow furrowed deeper. Finally, he found a separate highlighted note at the very bottom of the third page. His polite smile faltered into a look of deep, uncomfortable pity. "Right this way, please," he mumbled, unable to meet my eyes. He did not lead me toward the gilded double doors of the main ballroom. He did not point me toward the VIP lounge where the bridal party was gathering. Instead, he walked me down a narrow, dimly lit side corridor. The muffled sound of rushing water and the sharp scent of industrial lavender soap hit my nose before I even saw the sign. We were standing directly outside the women public restrooms. Nestled against the floral wallpaper, sitting squarely between the restroom entrance and a utility closet, was a single white plastic folding chair. It was the kind you would find at a cheap backyard barbecue. "Here you are," the host said. "The bride requested you be seated here until the ceremony begins." I stared at the plastic chair. Then I looked at the host and told him he had to be joking. He apologized again, turned on his heel, and practically sprinted back to the safety of the foyer. I stood in the hallway. The heavy bass of the orchestra warming up in the main ballroom vibrated through the floorboards. I did not yell. I did not cry. The days of me crying over my family and their blatant disrespect had ended in my 20s. The indignity was deliberate and calculated. I just stood there analyzing the sheer audacious cruelty of the gesture. "You are in the way," a sharp nasal voice echoed down the corridor. I turned to see Brittany marching toward me. She was flanked by 2 bridesmaids, her custom beaded gown trailing heavily behind her. She looked stunning, a perfect vision of the pristine golden child my parents had always worshipped. "Brittany," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm as I gestured to the plastic chair. "What is this?" Brittany did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms carefully so as not to wrinkle her bodice. "It is a chair, Cassidy, do not be dramatic." I reminded her it was a plastic folding chair next to the toilets. "Look, you have to understand." Brittany sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Jamal and his family are coming today." Jamal was a brilliant African-American architect who came from a deeply respected and highly educated family. His parents were people of genuine substance and grace. "They are actual VIPs," Brittany continued. "I cannot have you sitting in the front row, ruining the aesthetic with your vibe. You are always so stiff and serious. You would ruin the wedding video." "My vibe," I repeated. "Yes, you are depressing," she snapped. "Just sit there, eat an appetizer when they pass the trays around, and you can leave early. No one will even notice you are gone." Before I could process the absolute venom of her words, the sharp clicking of heels announced the arrival of our mother Diane. She bustled down the hallway, her face flushed with stress, holding a stack of floral arrangements. "Brittany, darling, the photographer is waiting in the suite," Diane cooed before her eyes snapped to me. Her warm expression instantly hardened into a mask of irritation. "Cassidy, good you are here." She did not hug me. She did not compliment my dress. Instead, Diane reached into her expensive clutch, pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper, and shoved it against my chest. Instinctively, I caught it. It was a valet parking ticket with a $50 fee scrawled across the top. "Pay this for me on your way out," Diane commanded, already turning her back to me. "Your sister has already spent $120,000 on this luxury venue. We are stretched entirely too thin. The least you can do is cover the valet for the bridal party. You should have wired your wedding gift weeks ago anyway to help us out." I looked down at the $50 ticket. I looked at the plastic folding chair. Then I looked at my mother and sister, who were already walking away, chatting animatedly about camera angles and lighting. They treated me exactly like the unpaid, unwanted staff they believed me to be. I did not scream. I simply opened my purse, pulled out my sleek black titanium credit card, and slid it behind the valet ticket. I was going to pay the $50. I was going to turn around, walk to my car, and sever ties with these people forever. But as I slipped the card into my clutch, my phone vibrated violently against my palm. I pulled it out. The screen illuminated the dim hallway. It was an urgent text message from David, my chief financial officer at my holding company. "Cassidy, call me immediately," the message read. I was reviewing the accounts. "Someone just bypassed our security filters and used your personal social security number and personal credit profile to authorize an $80,000 wire transfer. The funds were sent directly to the Oakhaven Estate merchant account to clear a remaining wedding balance." I stared at the glowing text. The words blurred, then sharpened into crystal clear focus. An $80,000 charge, made to my venue, using my social security number. The dull hum of the string quartet practicing in the ballroom faded into white noise. I stood motionless in the hallway, the harsh glow of my phone screen casting long shadows against the floral wallpaper. $80,000. I read my chief financial officer text a second time, then a third. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing, but the paralysis only lasted for 5 seconds. After that, the icy clinical precision that made me a multimillionaire in commercial real estate took over. I did not turn toward the exit. I did not walk to my car. I put my phone back into my clutch, adjusted the strap of my expensive dress, and stepped away from the plastic folding chair. I walked straight past the restrooms, turned the corner, and bypassed the velvet rope that guarded the VIP bridal suite. The heavy double mahogany doors were closed, flanked by two of my own hired security guards. They recognized me instantly. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Kevin, subtly nodded and stepped aside, pulling the heavy brass handle open for me. I stepped into the suite. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of aerosol hairspray, expensive lilies, and chilled champagne. The room was a whirlwind of activity. Makeup artists were packing up their kits, bridesmaids were taking mirror selfies, and in the center of it all stood my family. My father Thomas was leaning against a velvet chaise lounge, swirling amber liquid in a crystal Scotch glass. He wore a custom tuxedo projecting the image of a wealthy, successful patriarch. It was an image he had meticulously crafted on a middle-class salary, entirely funded by credit card debt and refinancing schemes. Diane was adjusting the train of Brittany and her custom gown, cooing over how perfect the lace looked in the natural light. "I need everyone who is not a blood relative out of this room right now," I said. My voice was not loud, but the absolute razor-sharp authority in my tone cut through the chatter like a knife. The makeup artist froze. The bridesmaids lowered their phones. Thomas slammed his scotch glass down on a side table, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim. "Cassidy, what is the meaning of this? You are supposed to be out in the hall. You are disrupting the photographer." I said out. I repeated, my eyes locked on the event staff. They did not need to be told a third time. Recognizing the danger in the room, the stylists and photographers quickly grabbed their gear and shuffled out the door. The bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances and scurried out right behind them. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving only the four of us in the sprawling suite. "Have you lost your mind?" Brittany shrieked, whirling around so fast she nearly tripped over her heavily beaded hem. "You are ruining my vibe. You are ruining my wedding day. Get out." I ignored her. I walked methodically across the plush Persian rug until I was standing directly in front of Thomas and Diane. $80,000, I said, keeping my voice dead level. The color drained from Diane and her face so fast, it was as if someone had pulled a plug. She took a sudden, staggering step back, her manicured hand flying to her throat. Thomas, however, simply stiffened his jaw, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of fake dominance. "I do not know what you are talking about," Thomas bluffed, his voice overly loud. "Do not insult my intelligence." "Dad, not today," I said, pulling my phone from my clutch and holding the screen up to his face. "My financial officer just flagged a fraudulent wire transfer. $80,000 was just authorized using my personal credit profile and my social security number to clear the remaining balance for this venue. You stole my identity." "Oh, for heaven's sake, Cassidy, stop being so theatrical," Thomas scoffed, waving his hand dismissively as if I had just complained about him borrowing a sweater. "We did not steal anything. We just co-signed your name as a guarantor. The venue required the final payment to clear today, and the banks were giving me a hard time with the liquidity limits on my accounts." "A guarantor?" I asked, the sheer absurdity of the lie hanging in the air. "Yes, a family favor," Diane chimed in, suddenly finding her voice. She took a step forward, adopting her classic manipulative, scolding mother tone. "Honestly, Cassidy, you have a good corporate job. Your sister needed this day to be perfect. We just temporarily used your credit profile to push the payment through. We were going to pay you back next year when your father gets his bonuses. You memorized my social security number from my old college tax forms, forged my digital signature, and initiated an $80,000 line of credit in my name without my consent," I stated, stripping away their soft euphemisms. "That is not a family favor, Mom. That is identity theft. That is wire fraud. That is a federal felony." "Oh, shut up!" Brittany yelled, stomping her satin heel onto the rug. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated entitlement. "It is 80 grand, Cassidy. You are so incredibly selfish. I am marrying into a prominent family today. Jamal and his parents are esteemed architects and real estate developers. I needed a venue that matched their status, and Oak Haven was the only place good enough. You should be happy to help me secure my future. By committing a felony," I asked, staring at my sister like she was an alien species. "It is only a crime if you report it, you dramatic psycho," Brittany sneered, crossing her arms. "Which you are not going to do. Because you are family. Now either shut up and go sit on your little plastic chair in the hallway, or get out of my venue." My venue. The words echoed in the opulent suite. I looked at the imported silk drapes. I looked at the crown molding. I looked at the crystal Scotch glass my father was drinking from. I owned the drapes. I owned the molding. I owned the glass. You are right, I said softly, a genuine chilling smile finally spreading across my face. Thomas let out a loud, patronizing sigh of relief, picking up his scotch glass again. Good. I am glad you are finally acting like an adult. We can discuss the repayment schedule over Thanksgiving dinner. Now please go back to the hall. Jamal and his parents are arriving any minute. I will leave the suite, I said, turning smoothly on my heel. I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, but paused with my hand on the brass handle. I looked back over my shoulder at the three of them. The father who stole from me, the mother who enabled him, and the sister who thought she was untouchable. Enjoy the ceremony, Brittany, I said softly. It is going to be highly memorable. I pushed the doors open and walked out, ignoring Brittany and her muffled, triumphant scoff behind me. I did not go back to the folding chair. I walked straight down the grand staircase, out the massive front doors, and into the cool evening air. As I walked down the stone path toward my Range Rover, I pulled up a text thread on my phone. I selected Gideon, the general manager of Oakhaven Estate. Gideon. I typed, my thumbs flying across the glass screen with merciless precision. The wedding party and the bridal suite just committed financial fraud using stolen credit. Cancel the grace period. Initiate the breach of contract protocol. Evict them. I hit send. The confirmation bubble appeared on my screen, glowing a bright green against the darkening evening sky. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and walked down the sweeping stone driveway toward the valet circle. The gravel crunched beneath my heels, a steady and rhythmic sound that grounded me. The cool autumn air hit my face, washing away the suffocating smell of hairspray and expensive lilies from the bridal suite. I approached the valet stand and handed the young attendant my ticket. He sprinted off to retrieve my black Range Rover. While I waited, I looked back at the grand facade of Oakhaven Estate. The massive Tudor-style windows blazed with warm golden light. I could see the silhouettes of guests mingling in the foyer, blissfully unaware of the financial crime that had just transpired upstairs. The valet pulled my car around, stepping out to hold the door open for me. I thanked him, slid into the driver's seat, and pressed the ignition button. The heavy doors closed with a solid thud, instantly silencing the lively chatter and the faint strains of the string quartet spilling from the mansion. I was finally alone in the soundproof sanctuary of my vehicle. I did not drive away immediately. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed my secure work laptop. I needed to verify the exact details of the transaction David had flagged. I opened the screen and typed in my encrypted master password. The Crescent Holdings corporate dashboard loaded instantly. I navigated to the merchant accounts for Oakhaven Estate. There it was. A pending wire transfer for $80,000. The origin account bore my name, my billing address, and a digital authorization code that utilized my social security number. I stared at the digital footprint of my parents' betrayal. They had not simply borrowed money. They had navigated a complex banking portal, bypassed standard verification by answering security questions only a family member would know, and forged my consent. I pulled up the primary legal deed for Oakhaven Estate on my screen. The document clearly listed Crescent Holdings as the sole proprietor, and my name sat at the very top of the corporate hierarchy. I had purchased this bankrupt property 2 years ago for $4 million in cash, and spent another $2 million renovating it into the premier event venue in the state. I opened a second tab to review the specific event contract Brittany had signed 6 months ago. Against my better judgment, I had instructed Gideon to grant her a massive family discount. The original rental fee for a Saturday evening in peak wedding season was $120,000. I had reduced it to $80,000, covering the catering and staff costs out of my own pocket just to avoid drama. Brittany had signed the agreement digitally, agreeing to the strict code of conduct and the payment terms. I scrolled down to Section 4, Paragraph 2. The clause was standard for all our luxury properties. Any use of fraudulent payment methods, stolen credit profiles, or unauthorized bank transfers will result in the immediate termination of this contract and the immediate eviction of the offending party without a refund. It was a failsafe designed to protect my business from shady promoters and unreliable clients. I never imagined I would be invoking it against my own mother and father. I downloaded the forged bank authorization and the signed venue contract, attaching them both to a fresh email. I sent the files directly to my corporate legal team with a short note instructing them to prepare for an identity theft claim. I closed the laptop and placed it back on the passenger seat. Through the tinted windshield of my Range Rover, I watched the real VIP guests arrive. A sleek silver Bentley pulled up to the valet stand, followed by a pair of black luxury sedans. The doors opened, and a distinguished group of people stepped out. I recognized Jamal and his parents immediately from the engagement photos Brittany had posted online. Jamal looked incredibly handsome in a tailored black tuxedo. He was a highly successful African-American architect known for designing sustainable urban spaces. He carried himself with a quiet, humble confidence that stood in stark contrast to the loud, flashy arrogance of my family. His parents stepped out behind him. His father wore a sharp charcoal suit, and his mother looked stunning in a deep emerald gown. They were both prominent figures in the medical and legal communities. They spoke politely to the valet, smiling warmly as they handed over their keys. They looked like genuinely good people. They looked like a family built on mutual respect and hard work. Watching Jamal and his parents ascend the stone steps to the venue, I felt a sharp pang of sympathy for the groom. He was a good man walking blindly into a family built on lies, manipulation, and financial fraud. He likely believed my parents were wealthy, successful professionals who were generously paying for this lavish wedding. He had no idea that the luxury he was experiencing was funded by identity theft and subsidized by the sister they had banished to the hallway. Brittany had probably spun some elaborate lie to explain my absence from the rehearsal dinner and the family photos. She probably painted me as the bitter, unsuccessful sister who was too jealous to participate. My family had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable asset, a scapegoat they could blame for their problems, and a piggy bank they could raid when their fake wealth ran dry. I leaned back against the leather headrest of my seat and took a deep, steadying breath. I watched the heavy oak doors of the mansion close behind Jamal and his family. The trap was set. The contract was breached. The grace period was officially over. I reached for the climate control dial and turned the air conditioning down. The silence inside my vehicle was absolute, but my mind was operating at maximum capacity. I opened a new application on my laptop. It was the master security portal for Oak Haven Estate. As the owner, I had access to every high-definition camera on the 40-acre property. The screen populated with a grid of live feeds. I clicked on the grand foyer camera, expanding it to fill my monitor. The video was crisp and clear. I watched closely as Jamal and his parents got intercepted by Thomas and Diane. My parents had transformed completely. Gone was the aggressive, panicked demeanor from the bridal suite. They were now playing the roles of gracious, affluent hosts. Thomas was shaking hands with Jamal's father, offering a wide, booming laugh that I could almost hear through the silent video feed. Diane was kissing Jamal's mother on the cheek, gesturing expansively toward the ballroom as if she had personally laid every marble tile. It was a sickening performance. They stood in a venue they stole, wearing clothes paid for by debt, hosting a family of genuine substance while radiating fake generational wealth. I zoomed in on Thomas. His custom tuxedo looked immaculate, but I knew the man inside it was morally bankrupt. He spent his life keeping up appearances at the expense of his daughter. He had drained my college fund when I was 19 to pay for Brittany and her luxury car. He had manipulated my credit when I was 22. I had spent a decade building an impenetrable fortress around my finances to keep him out. Yet here he was again, crossing federal lines, just to ensure his golden child had the perfect backdrop for her vanity project. My phone vibrated on the center console. The caller ID displayed Gideon. I answered immediately and put him on speakerphone. Cassidy Gideon said, his voice a low, professional baritone. "I received your text. I need verbal confirmation that we are executing a hard eviction. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with the breach of contract protocol? I stared at the live feed of my mother sipping champagne. I am absolutely certain, Gideon, I replied. They used stolen credentials to clear the $80,000 final balance. I have already forwarded the evidence to corporate legal. We are shutting it down. Understood, Gideon said without a trace of hesitation. He worked for Crescent Holdings for 4 years and knew exactly how ruthless I could be when threatened. What is our timeline? The orchestra is currently playing prelude music and the guests are taking their seats. I pulled up the schedule Brittany had aggressively emailed to the entire family months ago. The ceremony is scheduled to begin in exactly 14 minutes, I told him. I want you to wait until every single guest is seated. I want Thomas and Brittany lined up at the grand doors. When she is ready to make her grand entrance, you cut the music. You bring up the house lights, and you take the microphone. Gideon remained silent for a moment, absorbing the instructions. You want maximum exposure, he concluded. Yes, I said smoothly. They care about their social standing more than anything else in this world. They stole my identity to protect their image. I want that image dismantled in front of the exact audience they were trying to impress. I will prep the security team, Gideon confirmed. I have 12 men on site. We will secure the perimeter and escort the catering staff back to the kitchens so they are not caught in the crossfire. I will call you back in 10 minutes for the final green light. He disconnected the line. I immediately dialed David, my chief financial officer. He answered on the first ring. Cassidy, he said urgently, I am looking at the wire logs right now. It is a textbook synthetic identity bypass. They used your secondary verification answers. David, I said, keeping my tone entirely conversational. Flag the transaction as unauthorized fraud. Do not attempt to block it internally. I want you to initiate the federal reporting protocol with the bank. David paused. Cassidy, if I do that, the bank automated system will instantly trigger a felony alert. They will dispatch local law enforcement to the merchant location. That means the police are going to show up at Oak Haven. I know, I replied. Do it. I hung up the phone and looked back at my laptop screen. The foyer was nearly empty now. The guests were filtering into the main hall. I switched the camera feed to the ballroom interior. The space looked breathtaking. Hundreds of white orchids cascaded from the ceiling. The 200 guests were taking their seats on velvet-backed chairs. I saw distant cousins who mocked my career choices sitting in the front rows. I saw Brittany and her friends who bullied me taking their places of honor. Everyone who had ever looked down on me was sitting in a room that I owned, waiting for a ceremony that I was about to cancel. Outside my vehicle, the sun had finally dipped below the horizon. The automated exterior lights of Oak Haven Estate clicked on, illuminating the stone pathways and the towering oak trees. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the $50 valet ticket my mother had shoved against my chest. I traced the rough paper with my thumb. It was such a small, insignificant piece of trash, but it represented everything wrong with my family. They demanded my money and compliance. They offered me a plastic folding chair next to a restroom in return. I tore the valet ticket in half, dropping the pieces into the cup holder. The dashboard clock clicked forward. Now it was time. My phone rang again. It was Gideon. We are in position, Cassidy, he reported quietly. The guests are seated. The groom is at the altar. Thomas and the bride are stacked behind the double doors. We have a visual on them. The string quartet is preparing to play the bridal chorus. I watched the camera feed showing the corridor. Brittany was standing there, gripping her bouquet, her face glowing with triumphant entitlement. Thomas stood beside her, puffing out his chest. I thought about the identity theft. I thought about the years of emotional abuse. I thought about the plastic chair. Gideon, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper of absolute authority. Pull the plug. Evict them all. The line went dead. I lowered the phone to my lap and leaned closer to the glowing laptop screen illuminating the dark interior of my car. Time seemed to dilate, slowing to a crawl as I watched the live feeds. Gideon was a professional. He would execute the command with surgical precision. But these final seconds before the absolute destruction of my sister and her perfect day allowed me a moment to truly look at the man waiting at the end of the aisle. Jamal stood near the altar beneath a cascading canopy of white orchids. He was 31 years old, an esteemed African-American architect who had recently won a national award for his work on sustainable urban housing. Even through the grainy security footage, his quiet dignity was palpable. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that hugged his broad shoulders, but it was his posture that truly set him apart. He did not fidget. He did not scan the crowd for validation. He stood with the calm, grounded certainty of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he had built. I had only spoken to Jamal a handful of times at forced family dinners over the past 2 years. Every interaction left me wondering how a man of such profound substance had fallen into Brittany and her web of superficiality. Jamal was a man of deep principles. He spoke passionately about community development, equitable housing, and architectural integrity. Brittany had likely mirrored his intellect during their courtship, playing the role of a sophisticated, supportive partner while hiding her crushing credit card debt and insatiable hunger for status. She had seen his rising star and latched onto it, desperate to elevate herself into his social stratosphere. She wanted his name, his prestige, and his income to fund the lifestyle our parents had always promised her, but could never actually afford. I switched the camera view to focus on the front row of the ceremony seating. The contrast between the two sides of the aisle was jarring. On the left sat Jamal and his family. They were a portrait of generational grace and authentic achievement. His mother, an imposing and elegant woman in a deep emerald gown, was a highly respected retired judge. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her sat Jamal and his father, a renowned vascular surgeon who exuded a quiet, commanding presence. They were surrounded by aunts, uncles, and cousins who were university professors, engineers, and community leaders. They did not need to wear flashy designer labels plastered with logos to announce their worth. Their wealth was quiet. Their legacy was built on education, hard work, and unshakable moral foundations. Then I looked at the right side of the aisle. My extended family filled the rows, buzzing with loud, performative energy. I saw distant cousins snapping photos with their phones, desperate to broadcast their proximity to this level of luxury. I remembered how these same relatives had sneered at my decision to work in commercial real estate, calling it unglamorous and masculine. Now they were sitting on plush velvet chairs in a venue I owned, drinking imported water I had paid for, marveling at a lifestyle they assumed my father had miraculously provided. The contrast was not just in their behavior, but in their entire existence. Jamal and his family represented everything I respected. They built their lives on truth and effort. Brittany, Thomas, and Diane represented a hollow facade. Their entire reality was constructed from smoke mirrors and now stolen federal identities. Earlier in the foyer, I had watched on the monitors as Thomas and Diane attempted to mingle with Jamal and his parents. It had been excruciating to witness. Thomas had laughed too loudly, clapping Jamal and his father on the back with an aggressive familiarity that was completely unearned. Diane had practically thrown herself at the retired judge, complimenting her jewelry with a desperate, manic energy. Jamal and his parents had responded with polite, restrained smiles. They were far too well-bred to show outright disdain, but I could see the subtle tightening around his mother and her eyes. She was a judge. She had spent decades reading people piercing through lies from the bench. I knew she sensed the profound emptiness beneath my mother and her aggressive charm. She knew something was off about this family, even if she could not yet articulate exactly what it was. My chest tightened with a brief, sharp pang of guilt. By pulling the plug on this wedding, I was going to subject Jamal and his dignified family to a deeply humiliating public spectacle. They had flown in from across the country expecting a joyous celebration of love. Instead, they were about to be caught in the crossfire of a felony fraud eviction. But as I stared at Jamal standing so proudly at the altar, the guilt vanished, replaced by cold, hard logic. I was not ruining his life. I was saving it. If I allowed this ceremony to proceed, Jamal would be legally binding himself to a family of criminals. He would merge his pristine credit, his hard-earned assets, and his untarnished reputation with a woman who believed laws did not apply to her. Brittany would drain his bank accounts just as easily as she had authorized the theft of my social security number. She would lie to his face, manipulate his kindness, and bleed him dry, while Thomas and Diane cheered her on from the sidelines. Jamal deserved a partner of equal substance. He deserved a family that would treat his legacy with respect, not a pack of parasites looking for their next host. The orchestra on my audio feed swelled, beginning the final crescendo of the prelude. The guests hushed, turning their heads toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the hall. The 14-minute mark had arrived. The stage was perfectly set. I kept my eyes locked on the monitor, watching Gideon step out from the side corridor near the audio control booth. He was flanked by 4 massive security guards in identical black suits. They moved with silent military precision. Jamal shifted his weight at the altar, his eyes bright with anticipation, as he looked toward the doors, waiting for a bride who had built this entire moment on a foundation of theft. My finger hovered over the laptop screen. The string quartet raised their bows to begin the bridal chorus. It was time for the illusion to shatter. The monitors displayed the exact second the atmosphere shifted. Inside the ballroom, the ambiance was perfectly curated. The lighting transitioned from a soft, ambient glow to a dramatic cinematic spotlighting effect that highlighted the cascading white orchids. The 200 guests were finding their final places. I watched the live feed as the ushers dressed in crisp white jackets guided the stragglers to their velvet-backed chairs. The hum of polite conversation filled the cavernous room. It was the sound of money, of expectation, of high society waiting to be entertained. On the left side of the aisle, Jamal and his family sat with quiet composure. His mother, the retired judge, leaned over to whisper something to his father. They looked completely at ease, anticipating a beautiful union. On the right side, my extended family was a hive of restless energy. Aunts and uncles who had ignored my college graduation were now craning their necks, phones raised high, desperate to capture content for their social media feeds. They wanted the world to know they belonged in a place like Oak Haven Estate. The string quartet, positioned on a raised platform near the altar, finished their tuning. The lead violinist gave a subtle nod. The first notes of the prelude drifted through the ballroom. The melody was rich and resonant, bouncing off the imported Italian marble floors and echoing up to the vaulted ceiling. It was a piece by Bach specifically requested by Brittany to project an air of old money sophistication. I had approved the invoice for the musicians myself 3 months ago. They were top-tier professionals charging premium rates. Everything in that room, from the imported silk table runners to the crystal champagne flutes waiting on silver trays in the adjacent reception hall, was paid for by the very woman my family had banished to a folding chair by the toilets. I switched my attention to a different camera angle. This one focused on the rear of the ballroom, capturing the heavy mahogany double doors where the bridal procession would begin. Gideon stood just off to the side, half hidden in the shadows of an ornate stone archway. He looked immaculate in his tailored black suit, a discreet earpiece curled around his right ear. Gideon was a former military officer before transitioning to high-end hospitality management. He understood chain of command. He understood the importance of executing orders without hesitation. Beside him, 2 of my top security personnel stood with their hands clasped behind their backs. They were not smiling. They were scanning the room, assessing the crowd, preparing for the inevitable fallout. My phone vibrated. The screen illuminated the dark interior of my Range Rover. It was a text from Gideon. The venue is sealed. The catering staff has been relocated to the service corridors. Security is in position at all exits. We are holding on your final command. I read the text. A strange sense of profound calm washed over me. For 33 years, I had navigated the treacherous waters of my family and their endless demands. I had swallowed my pride. I had bitten my tongue. I had played the role of the dutiful, invisible daughter while Brittany soaked up the sun. I had allowed them to take my money, my time, and my dignity. But identity theft was the absolute final line. They had crossed into federal crime territory simply to fund an aesthetic. They had weaponized my credit profile to buy the illusion of success. That illusion ended tonight. I picked up the phone. I did not text him back. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted him to hear mine. I dialed his direct line. He answered immediately. Cassidy. Are we ready? I asked, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion. We are fully prepped, Gideon replied. The groom is at the altar. The guests are seated. The music is playing. The bride and her father are stacked behind the main doors. They are waiting for the cue to open them. I looked at the monitor showing the corridor outside the ballroom. There was Thomas. He was adjusting his bow tie, looking remarkably smug. He patted Brittany on the arm. She was taking deep, theatrical breaths, holding her expensive bouquet with a white-knuckled grip. She was ready for her grand entrance. She was ready for the applause, the adoration, the collective gasp of 200 people admiring her stolen perfection. I stared at the screen. I saw the mother who had shoved a $50 valet ticket into my chest. I saw the father who had forged my signature. I saw the sister who had ordered me to sit next to the public restrooms. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully manipulated the system, secured the wealthy groom, and discarded the useless sister. They thought they were untouchable. Gideon, I said, leaning back into the leather seat of my car. Yes, Cassidy, you have the final green light. Execute the breach of contract protocol. Cut the music. Bring up the house lights. Evict them. Understood, Gideon said. The line went dead. I did not blink. I kept my eyes glued to the master security monitor. I watched as Gideon raised his right hand, tapping his earpiece. He signaled the audio-visual control booth located in the mezzanine. He nodded to the security guards flanking the heavy mahogany doors. The guards stepped forward in perfect unison. Inside the ballroom, the string quartet was building toward the crescendo. The guests were shifting in their seats, turning their bodies toward the back of the room, cameras ready. Jamal stood tall at the altar, a soft smile playing on his lips as he waited for his bride. The anticipation in the room was palpable, thick and heavy. It was a masterpiece of tension, perfectly engineered for a spectacular collapse. Outside the doors, Thomas placed his hand over Brittany and her hand. He gave her one final encouraging nod. He reached forward to push the heavy brass handles. I watched the screen, my heart beating in a slow, measured rhythm. The green light was given. The gears were in motion. There was no turning back. The empire they had built on my stolen identity was about to be burned to the ground in front of a live audience. The audio wave on my dashboard indicated the precise moment the sound engineer received Gideon and his command. The transition from the romantic symphony to the brutal reality of the eviction was going to be instantaneous. I watched the security personnel adjust their stances, their faces hardened masks of professionalism. They were ready to handle the affluent crowd. They were ready to handle Thomas. I took a deep breath of the cool air inside my car. The stage was set. The actors were in position. The final curtain was about to fall on Brittany and her stolen wedding day. The heavy brass handles of the grand mahogany doors gleamed on my monitor as Thomas wrapped his hands around them. He leaned his weight forward, pushing the massive doors inward to reveal the sweeping center aisle of the ballroom. Brittany stood right beside him, her chin tilted up at a practiced angle. She had spent months rehearsing this exact moment, ensuring her posture projected the effortless grace of old money. She gripped her cascading bouquet of white orchids so tightly her knuckles showed white through the feed. They took their first synchronized step over the threshold. They expected a wall of sound. They expected the string quartet to swell into the triumphant soaring notes of the bridal chorus. They expected 200 high society guests to stand in unison, turning with tears of admiration in their eyes. They expected Jamal to look down the aisle and marvel at the spectacular wealthy family he was marrying into. They received none of that. The exact second Brittany and her satin heel touched the imported marble floor of the main hall, the breach of contract protocol activated. It was not a subtle transition. It was a digital execution. The audio engineer in the mezzanine flipped the master breaker for the performance soundboard. The romantic acoustic amplification of the string quartet vanished instantly. A sharp, brief screech of audio feedback pierced the air, echoing violently off the vaulted ceilings. The musicians on the raised platform jerked their bows away from their instruments in shock, turning confused glances toward the control booth. Before the guests could even process the sudden deafening silence, the lighting system responded. The warm, golden ambient uplighting that had bathed the room in a romantic cinematic glow was terminated. In its place, the venue automated maintenance lights slammed on. These were heavy industrial fluorescent beams designed specifically for the late-night cleaning crews to spot stains on the carpets. The harsh, clinical white light flooded the cavernous room, completely stripping away the magical aesthetic Brittany had stolen. Under the brutal glare of the maintenance lights, the thousands of white orchids suddenly looked stark and rigid. The carefully draped silk table runners lost their soft shimmer. Brittany and Thomas froze mid-step. They were completely exposed at the top of the aisle, standing in a room that suddenly felt like a sterile warehouse rather than a luxury estate. I watched the live feed from my Range Rover, my eyes darting across the grid of monitors to capture every reaction. The collective confusion of the 200 guests was immediate. Whispers erupted across the velvet-backed chairs. People who had been holding up their phones to record a fairy tale entrance lowered their devices, looking around the starkly lit room with furrowed brows. On the left side of the aisle, the groom family reacted with characteristic restraint, but their unease was undeniable. Jamal dropped his hands to his sides, his warm smile vanishing into a tight line of concern. He stepped forward slightly, peering down the aisle at Brittany, clearly assuming a catastrophic power failure had just occurred. Beside him, his mother, the retired judge, did not look at the bride. She looked at the walls, observing the deliberate nature of the lighting change. Her judicial instincts were already calculating that this was no accident. Thomas, desperate to maintain the illusion of control, leaned over and hissed something into Brittany and her ear. I could read his body language perfectly. He was telling her to keep moving, to smile through the technical difficulty, to pretend everything was fine. He was relying on his usual tactic of arrogant denial. He placed his hand firmly on her lower back and practically shoved her forward. Brittany stumbled slightly but caught her balance. She plastered a rigid, terrifyingly fake smile onto her face and took another step down the aisle. Her heavily beaded custom gown, which was meant to sparkle under the romantic spotlights, now just looked heavy, overly complicated, and garish under the brutal fluorescent glare. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the heavy, awkward clicking of her heels against the marble floor. There was no music. There was no applause. There was only the uncomfortable sound of a woman walking into a void. She made it exactly 5 steps down the aisle before her path was physically blocked. Gideon stepped out from the shadows of the ornate stone archway. He did not walk with the deferential, apologetic posture of a venue manager experiencing a technical glitch. He walked with the squared shoulders and measured, predatory pace of a former military officer neutralizing a threat. Behind him, the 4 massive security guards in identical black suits fanned out, forming an impenetrable human wall directly across the center aisle. They crossed their hands in front of them, planting their feet on the marble. They effectively cut off any possibility of Brittany reaching the altar. The whispering among the guests abruptly stopped. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confused to highly alarmed. The sight of 5 imposing men blocking the bride in a harsh, bright room triggered a primal sense of danger. Guests in the front rows began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some of the older attendees murmured anxiously to one another. Thomas immediately puffed up his chest, dropping Brittany and her arm to march aggressively toward Gideon. I watched his mouth moving rapidly on the silent video feed, his face turning a mottled shade of red. He was undoubtedly demanding answers, throwing his weight around, perhaps even threatening to sue the venue or have Gideon fired for ruining the entrance. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at Gideon and his chest. Gideon did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply looked at Thomas with an expression of absolute Arctic indifference. He let Thomas rant for exactly 3 seconds. Then Gideon completely ignored him. Gideon reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek wireless microphone. He turned his back on my father, dismissing him entirely, and took 2 steps toward the center of the room. He raised the microphone to his mouth. The audio feed in my car cracked to life, synced to the master public address system of the estate. I leaned forward in my leather seat, turning the volume dial up. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The $80,000 lie was about to be dragged into the unforgiving fluorescent light. Every guest, every distant relative, and every member of Jamal and his principled family was about to hear exactly how my parents funded this fraudulent spectacle. The feedback whine of the microphone settled into a low, steady hum. Gideon tapped the steel mesh head twice with his index finger. The rhythmic tapping echoed off the imported Italian marble floors and bounded up to the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. It was a sharp mechanical sound that demanded absolute compliance. The 200 guests scattered across the velvet-backed chairs froze entirely. The collective intake of breath sucked all the oxygen from the massive room. You could hear a pin drop in the silence that followed. It was not the reverent, respectful quiet of a wedding ceremony. It was the tense, electrified silence of a crowd recognizing that something was horribly wrong. Gideon stood with his shoulders squared. He did not look at Thomas, who was now practically vibrating with rage just 3 feet away. He did not look at Brittany, whose heavily beaded gown looked like a tragic costume under the unforgiving maintenance lights. Gideon looked directly out at the sea of affluent guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gideon began, his voice projecting through the master audio system with deep, resonant authority. "I apologize for this abrupt interruption to the proceedings. My name is Gideon, and I am the general manager of Oak Haven Estate. We are currently experiencing a severe administrative and legal violation regarding the primary contract for this event." A collective gasp rippled through the right side of the aisle. My extended family members exchanged panicked, bewildered glances. Aunts and uncles who had spent the last hour posting boastful photos online suddenly lowered their phones to their laps. On the left side of the aisle, Jamal stood completely rigid. His hands were clasped in front of him. His eyes darted from Gideon to Brittany and then to Thomas. Jamal was an architect who dealt with contracts and massive budgets daily. He understood the gravity of a venue manager publicly interrupting a wedding to declare a legal violation. Beside him, his mother, the retired judge, narrowed her eyes. She did not gasp. She sat with the terrifying stillness of a woman analyzing a crime scene. Thomas finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He lunged forward, reaching a frantic hand toward Gideon to snatch the microphone. "You turn that off right now!" Thomas bellowed, his face twisting into a mask of pure panic. "I am paying for this venue! You work for me! Get out of my way!" Thomas never even made contact with the microphone. The 2 security guards flanking Gideon moved with terrifying synchronization. One guard stepped smoothly into Thomas, and his path using his broad chest and a firmly planted forearm to halt my father and his forward momentum. The guard did not strike him. He simply became an immovable brick wall. Thomas slammed into the guard and bounced back, stumbling awkwardly in his expensive tuxedo. The second guard took a single step toward Brittany, placing himself between the bride and the general manager. Brittany shrieked, clutching her cascading white orchids to her chest. Gideon did not even blink at the physical altercation happening inches from his tailored suit. He kept the microphone raised to his lips, holding the attention of the 200 stunned guests. "Please remain seated," Gideon instructed the crowd, his tone remaining perfectly level. "The situation is under control by our security personnel. However, I must inform you that the financial transaction authorized to secure this venue for the evening has been flagged by federal banking authorities as fraudulent." The word fraudulent dropped into the ballroom like a live grenade. The silence shattered instantly. The room erupted into a chaotic symphony of whispers and frantic questioning. People shifted uncomfortably in their velvet chairs. The guests on my family side looked around defensively. Diane, who had been lingering near the back of the room, let out a loud dramatic sob and covered her face with her hands. She knew it was over. The pristine illusion of generational wealth she had curated for Jamal and his prominent family was disintegrating under the harsh fluorescent maintenance lights. I sat in the dark cabin of my Range Rover, gripping the steering wheel as I watched the monitors. My heart pounded a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. I felt no remorse. I felt no pity. I felt the profound cleansing relief of truth finally breaking through decades of gaslighting and manipulation. I zoomed the camera feed in on Jamal. He had stepped down from the altar platform. He was marching down the center aisle directly toward the blockade of security guards. His father followed close behind him, offering a silent show of solidarity. Gideon raised his free hand, signaling for quiet. The authority radiating from him compelled the guests to lower their voices back to a tense murmur. To be clear, Gideon continued projecting his voice over the residual chatter. The final payment for this venue was processed less than an hour ago using stolen identity credentials and unauthorized credit profiles. The actual owner of Oakhaven Estate has been notified of this federal crime. The bank has initiated their automatic fraud protocols. Consequently, the management team has no choice but to terminate the event contract immediately. Thomas was hyperventilating now. He clawed at the security guard, attempting to push past him. "This is a misunderstanding," Thomas yelled desperately, trying to project his voice to the crowd without a microphone. "It is a banking error. My bank put a hold on the transfer. We have the money. We are good for it. Do not listen to him." Gideon finally turned his head to look directly at Thomas. The expression on the general manager face was devoid of any customer service warmth. It was the look of a man executing an eviction on a squatter. "It is not a banking error," Sir Gideon stated clearly into the microphone, ensuring every single person in the room heard the correction. "You did not use your own bank account. You utilized a stolen social security number to bypass our financial security filters. The true owner of that identity has officially pressed charges." Brittany dropped her bouquet. The expensive arrangement of white orchids hit the marble floor with a dull thud, scattering petals across the pristine surface. She covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with sheer terror. She looked wildly toward the front of the room, seeking salvation from the man she was supposed to marry. But Jamal was not looking at her with love. He was standing just a few feet away on the other side of the security blockade, staring at Brittany and Thomas with an expression of absolute disgust. The distinguished architect who built his life on integrity was currently trapped in a room with people who had just been publicly accused of a felony. I watched the horror dawn on the faces of my extended family. The harsh cleaning lights illuminated every drop of sweat on Thomas and his forehead, and every tremor in Brittany and her hands. They were entirely trapped in a prison of their own making. Gideon stood tall, holding the microphone, waiting for the next phase of the protocol. Gideon raised the microphone slightly higher, ensuring his voice would slice through the rising panic of the crowd. "Therefore, it is my duty to inform all 200 guests that this wedding ceremony is officially and unequivocally cancelled." The words struck the marble floor like a judge dropping a gavel. "There is no grace period. There is no alternative payment arrangement available at this time. Crescent Holdings maintains a zero-tolerance policy for financial crimes committed on our properties. Furthermore, the fraudulent wire transfer is only one half of the contractual breach. Oakhaven Estate operates under a strict code of conduct designed to protect our employees and our patrons from harassment. The bride and her immediate family have repeatedly and flagrantly violated this policy throughout the afternoon." Brittany let out a sharp, offended gasp. "I did not harass anyone. You are making this up to ruin my life." She pointed a trembling manicured finger at Gideon. "I am paying for top-tier service. You are paying with a stolen identity," Gideon corrected her with lethal precision. "And you did not just abuse my staff. You verbally assaulted our event host. You degraded our valet attendants." And most egregiously, you forced a credentialed VIP guest to sit in a plastic folding chair in a utility corridor next to the public restrooms simply because you deemed her an aesthetic liability to your photographs. A wave of shocked murmurs rolled through the left side of the aisle. Jamal and his parents exchanged darkened glances. They were people who respected service workers and valued basic human decency. Hearing that the bride had treated staff and family members like disposable garbage was a fatal blow to whatever illusion Brittany had cast over them. Because of the financial fraud and the documented hostility toward personnel, Gideon announced, his baritone voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "We are initiating an immediate property-wide eviction. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. 15 minutes." The timeline caused a fresh eruption of panic among my extended family. Aunts and uncles who had traveled from out of state began clutching their designer handbags and whispering frantically to one another in utter disbelief. Gideon continued listing the logistical reality of the eviction. "Our security team will guide you toward the main exit doors. The valet staff has already been instructed to begin pulling vehicles around to the front drive. The catering service has been halted. No food or beverages will be served tonight. The reception hall is locked. You must proceed directly to your cars. Anyone remaining on the property after the 15-minute window will be considered a trespasser and will be dealt with by the local authorities who are currently en route to this location." Thomas broke away from the security guard who had been blocking him. He did not charge forward this time. Instead, his posture crumbled into a pathetic display of desperate negotiation. He reached into his custom tuxedo jacket and pulled out a leather checkbook. "Listen to me," Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking under the fluorescent maintenance lights. "We can fix this. I can write you a personal check right now for the $80,000. I will write it for $100,000. Just turn the music back on. Just let us finish the ceremony. You cannot do this to my daughter in front of these people." Gideon looked down at the checkbook and my father and his shaking hands. The general manager did not even blink. Sir Gideon said, his voice stripped of any hospitality, "We do not accept personal checks from individuals who have just been flagged for federal wire fraud. Your credit is a liability. Your presence is a liability. Put your checkbook away and escort your family to the exit." "But the embarrassment," Diane wailed from the back of the room, pushing her way down the aisle toward her husband and daughter. She grabbed Thomas by the arm, her eyes wide with mascara running down her cheeks. "You cannot humiliate us like this. We have prominent guests. We have doctors and judges sitting right there." She gestured wildly toward Jamal and his family. Gideon remained an immovable fortress of protocol. Your humiliation is a direct result of your own criminal actions. Oak Haven Estate is not responsible for protecting the social standing of individuals who steal social security numbers. The clock is ticking. You now have exactly 12 minutes. I sat in the leather driver's seat of my Range Rover, watching the live feed on my encrypted laptop. The satisfaction washing over me was absolute. For decades, my parents had prioritized their public image over my basic well-being. They had sacrificed my financial security, my emotional health, and my dignity just to maintain the illusion of upper-class perfection. Now that exact illusion was being shredded in front of the most important audience they had ever assembled. I watched my extended relatives, the same cousins and aunts who had sneered at my career choices, awkwardly standing up from their velvet chairs. They were gathering their silk wraps and expensive clutches with trembling hands, avoiding eye contact with Jamal and his family, shuffling toward the mahogany doors like a flock of frightened sheep. Brittany was hyperventilating at the altar. She dropped to her knees on the imported marble floor, the heavy layers of her custom-beaded gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She grabbed the fabric of Thomas and his tuxedo pants, begging him to fix it, begging him to make Gideon turn the romantic spotlights back on. But Thomas was powerless. The man who had spent his entire life bullying his way out of consequences had finally hit a brick wall he could not manipulate, bribe, or threaten. The security guards began moving down the aisles politely but firmly, directing the 200 guests toward the grand foyer. Jamal and his family absolutely did not need to be told twice. Jamal and his family absolutely did not need to be told twice. His mother stood up with the commanding presence of a woman who had spent her life presiding over courtrooms. She did not look back at the altar. She simply picked up her emerald clutch and signaled to her husband and extended family. They moved as a single, cohesive unit toward the rear exit, their faces set in expressions of polite but absolute horror. The contrast between their dignified retreat and the chaotic stampede of my own relatives was staggering. Aunts and uncles pushed past one another, arguing loudly about who had paid for flights and who was going to reimburse their hotel stays. A cousin from my father's side actually grabbed a centerpiece arrangement of white orchids off a nearby table, clutching it to her chest as if looting a sinking ship. The fluorescent maintenance lights beat down on the disastrous scene, stripping away every ounce of elegance that had existed just 5 minutes prior. The sound of 200 people, frantically whispering, shouting, and scraping their velvet-backed chairs against the marble floor, created a deafening echo in the cavernous ballroom. Security guards maintained a disciplined perimeter, their hands resting neutrally at their waists, ensuring the mass exodus continued safely but swiftly toward the grand foyer. At the front of the room, Brittany finally scrambled up from the imported marble floor. The heavy layers of her custom-beaded gown tangled around her legs, causing her to stagger awkwardly. Her veil had slipped back, pulling at her carefully styled hair and creating a messy, unhinged silhouette. The tears of panic she had shed only moments ago instantly evaporated, replaced by a violent, blinding rage. She ripped the veil from her head, tossing it onto the floor, and marched directly toward Gideon. Thomas reached out to grab her arm, desperately trying to pull her back into line, but she shoved him away with surprising force. Her face was contorted, her jaw set, her eyes wide and manic. She stopped just inches from the invisible barrier the security guards had formed around the general manager. She pointed her finger directly at Gideon, and his face, her acrylic nails shaking with fury. "You listen to me right now," Brittany screamed, her voice cracking over the ambient noise of the fleeing crowd. "You are making the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. You do not talk to my family this way. You do not treat me this way on my wedding day. I paid for this venue. I signed the contract. You are just a hired manager. You are a nobody." Gideon looked down at her pointed finger. He did not flinch. He did not step back. He maintained the exact same expression of Arctic indifference he had worn since stepping up to the microphone. His silence only fueled Brittany and her rage. She slammed her hands onto her hips, taking a deep, ragged breath. "I know the owner of this estate," Brittany shrieked, lying with the same effortless ease she had practiced her entire life. "We have mutual friends in commercial real estate. She gave me a massive discount because she respects my father and his business connections. When I call her tomorrow morning, you are going to be fired. I am going to make sure you are blacklisted from every luxury event management company on the East Coast. I am going to sue you personally for emotional distress, and I am going to sue Crescent Holdings for breach of contract. I will own this entire property by the time my lawyers are done with you. Now turn the music back on, dim these hideous lights, and fix this before I make that phone call." Thomas and Diane stepped up behind their daughter, nodding along with her aggressive, fabricated threats. They were clinging to the lie, desperately hoping that loud, arrogant intimidation would somehow override federal fraud protocols. I sat in my Range Rover watching the monitor with a cold, analytical fascination. It was incredible to witness their delusion in high definition. Gideon let the silence stretch for 5 long seconds after Brittany finished her tirade. He looked at Thomas, he looked at Diane, then he looked directly into Brittany and her furious, tear-streaked face. "You are welcome to call the owner of Crescent Holdings," Gideon said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. "In fact, she instructed me to give you a message regarding your threat of legal action. She said she welcomes the lawsuit, assuming you can find an attorney willing to represent a client facing active federal indictment for wire fraud and identity theft." Brittany let out a loud, mocking laugh. It was a harsh, brittle sound that echoed through the nearly empty front section of the ballroom. "You have no idea who you are dealing with," she sneered. "I have the owner and her personal cell phone number right here in my purse. I will call her right now and put her on speakerphone. Do it. Gideon challenged, his eyes locking onto hers with lethal intensity. Call her immediately. But I can save you the trouble of searching through your contacts. You do not need to look up the owner of Oak Haven Estate, the chief executive officer of Crescent Holdings, or the woman who personally approved your discounted venue contract. Brittany paused, her hand freezing halfway to her beaded clutch. The absolute certainty in Gideon and his voice made her falter. Thomas swallowed hard, a sudden look of dawning horror creeping into his eyes. Diane clutched her husband and his arm, her knuckles turning white instantly. The owner of this property, Gideon stated, enunciating every single word with deliberate, crushing clarity, is the exact same woman you forced to sit on a plastic folding chair in the hallway next to the public restrooms. The owner is your older sister, Cassidy. The truth was spoken aloud, and it was entirely impossible for them to deny it any longer. The absolute silence that followed Gideon and his declaration was heavy enough to crush bone. Brittany stood with her mouth hanging open, her eyes darting frantically between the imposing general manager and the harsh fluorescent lights above. She looked like she had been physically struck. The smug entitlement that had defined her entire existence simply evaporated, leaving behind a terrified child dressed in a ruined custom gown. But while Brittany was paralyzed by the social humiliation, Thomas and Diane were experiencing a much darker and much more dangerous realization. The true scale of their catastrophic mistake was finally registering in their very minds. Thomas staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking awkwardly against the imported marble floor. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He was a man who spent his life manipulating credit lines and dodging debt collectors. In that agonizing moment of clarity, Thomas realized that the $80,000 fraudulent wire transfer was not just a clever bypass of a faceless banking institution. He had committed identity theft against a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire. He had stolen the personal social security number of a chief executive officer who possessed the resources, the legal team, and the absolute willingness to utterly destroy him. Diane let out a low, guttural wheeze. She clutched her throat, her manicured fingers digging into her own skin. Jamal and his distinguished family were still visible in the grand foyer, pausing to speak with the security personnel. Diane watched her carefully constructed illusion of generational wealth burn to ash in real time. Her country club friends, her judgmental neighbors, and the prominent family she had been so desperate to impress were all witnessing her public eviction. She was socially dead, and she knew it. Thomas snapped out of his shock, driven by the pure animalistic instinct of self-preservation. He realized the police were actively en route to the estate. He had to stop the momentum. He had to buy his way out of the trap. He physically shoved Brittany aside, ignoring her sharp gasp of surprise, and lunged toward Gideon. He closed the distance, attempting to corner the general manager against the floral altar arrangements. Thomas moved with the frantic, sweaty desperation of a man backed up against a cliff. "Listen to me," Thomas pleaded, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his leather-bound checkbook. "We can fix this right now. You are a businessman. I am a businessman. Everything has a price. Just tell the security team to lock the doors and keep the police out. I will write you a personal check right now for the $80,000. Gideon did not step back. He stood his ground, looking down at the trembling checkbook with an expression of profound disgust. He did not reach for the pen. Thomas misinterpreted the silence as a negotiation tactic. He frantically flipped the checkbook open, pressing it against his own palm as a makeshift desk. "Fine," Thomas hissed. $100,000. I will give you a $20,000 bonus directly into your personal account. Just call Cassidy, call my daughter, and tell her we are sorry. Tell her it was a misunderstanding. Just stop the police from coming up that driveway." Sir Gideon replied, his baritone voice echoing clearly in the vast, emptying room. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding your current reality. You cannot bribe your way out of a federal automated fraud protocol. The banking system flagged the transaction the moment Crescent Holdings reported the identity theft. The authorities were dispatched by the financial institution, not by my front desk. I do not have the authority to cancel a federal police dispatch. Diane rushed forward, her heavily beaded heels slipping on the scattered white orchid petals. She grabbed Gideon by the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket, her eyes wide and manic. "You have to call her Diane," begged her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "She is my daughter. She would never actually send her own parents to federal prison. Please, just dial her number. Put her on speakerphone. I am her mother. I can talk some sense into her." Gideon gently but firmly peeled Diane and her grasping fingers off his suit jacket. He took a single deliberate step back, aligning himself with his imposing security guards. "Ma," Gideon stated, his voice completely stripped of any human sympathy. "Your daughter gave me very specific instructions regarding your communication attempts. She anticipated you would try to leverage your biological relationship to escape the legal consequences of your theft. She told me to remind you of the plastic folding chair. She told me to remind you of the $50 valet ticket. She is not throwing a tantrum. She is executing a corporate protocol against hostile actors who defrauded her business." Thomas let out a ragged, desperate breath. He looked down at the blank check in his hands, finally comprehending that his money was entirely useless. He looked up at Gideon, his eyes wide with the terrifying realization that he was about to lose his freedom. 150,000. Thomas blurted out, his voice cracking into a sob. "Please, I will give you everything I have. Just let us leave before the police arrive for us. I cannot go to jail." Gideon raised his left arm and checked his watch. He looked back at Thomas and Diane with cold, unwavering eyes. "You have exactly 7 minutes left before you are formally charged with criminal trespassing on top of the wire fraud. I suggest you spend that time walking to the front gates. The authorities will be waiting for you there." The word "there" hung in the harsh fluorescent air of the ruined ballroom like a physical weight. Thomas and Diane stood completely paralyzed, their frantic escape plans short-circuiting against the reality of federal law. Before either of them could formulate another pathetic bribe, a new voice cut through the heavy tension. "Excuse me?" Jamal said. The groom stepped forward. His heavy, measured footsteps echoed against the imported marble as he bypassed the retreating stragglers of my extended family. Jamal did not look panicked. He did not look like a man whose wedding had just been spectacularly cancelled. He looked like an architect analyzing a building that was suffering from severe structural failure. He bypassed Brittany entirely, walking right up to the confrontation between his future in-laws and my general manager. "Mr. Gideon," Jamal said, his tone remaining incredibly calm, but carrying the undeniable weight of a man accustomed to leading multi-million-dollar projects. "I need absolute clarity right now. You just announced to 200 people that this venue was secured with fraudulent payment. You used the word stolen identity." Thomas instantly snapped out of his frozen stupor. He practically threw himself between Jamal and Gideon, throwing his hands up in a placating, desperate gesture. "Jamal, son, please do not listen to this hired help." Thomas laughed, a shrill, terrifying sound that bordered on manic. "It is a corporate mix-up, a banking error. You know how these massive commercial institutions are. They flag large transactions for no reason. I am handling it. Go back to your parents. We will have the music back on in 5 minutes." Jamal did not even look at Thomas. He kept his dark, intelligent eyes locked firmly on Gideon. "My future father-in-law assured my family that Oakhaven Estate was secured and paid in full 6 months ago as a wedding gift to us," Jamal stated, his voice dropping an octave. "Did he or did he not pay for this venue?" Gideon looked at Jamal with a subtle flicker of professional respect. He recognized a man of integrity searching for the truth amidst a sea of liars. Sir Gideon replied, keeping his posture perfectly rigid. "A deposit was placed 6 months ago. However, that deposit was heavily subsidized by a severe family discount granted by the actual owner. The remaining balance of $80,000 was due today. When Mr. Thomas lacked the liquid funds to clear the account, He utilized his oldest daughter's personal identity to forcefully extract a line of credit without her authorization. Jamal processed the information with terrifying speed. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He finally turned his head to look at Brittany. My sister was trembling, her hands clutching the ruined fabric of her custom beaded gown. Black streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, ruining her pristine bridal makeup. Is this true? Jamal asked her. The question was not a shout, it was a surgical strike. Brittany let out a loud dramatic sob, reaching out to grab Jamal by the sleeve of his tuxedo. Jamal, baby, you have to believe me, she cried, her voice pitching into a desperate whine. My sister Cassidy is a bitter, jealous psycho. She hates that I am marrying someone as successful as you. She is lying about the money to ruin my perfect day. She wants to destroy us. Jamal looked down at Brittany and her grasping hands. He did not pull away, but he did not offer her any comfort. You told me your sister was a struggling, low-level assistant, Jamal said, dissecting her lies piece by piece. You told me she was too financially unstable to even afford a bridesmaid dress, which is why she was not in the wedding party. You told me she was an embarrassment. Yes. Brittany nodded, frantically clinging to the narrative. She is a failure. She is a nobody. If she is a struggling assistant, Jamal countered, his voice growing dangerously cold. How does she own a multi-million-dollar commercial estate? And more importantly, how does she possess an $80,000 liquid credit line for your father to steal? Brittany opened her mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. The mathematical impossibility of her own lies had finally trapped her. She looked wildly at Diane, begging her mother to intervene. Diane stepped forward, putting on her best wounded matriarch routine. Jamal, you must understand. Diane pleaded, placing a hand over her heart. Families have complicated financial arrangements. We were just borrowing Cassidy and her good credit to ensure your special day was flawless. We were protecting you from the stress. A sharp, commanding voice interrupted Diane mid-sentence. In my courtroom, we do not call that a family arrangement. We call that a Class C felony. Jamal and his mother, the retired judge, stepped into the circle. She had left the safety of the foyer to stand beside her son. Her deep emerald gown swept across the marble floor as she approached. She looked at Diane with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. She possessed a terrifying judicial presence that instantly made Diane shrink backward. Mrs. Diane, the judge, continued, her voice slicing through the air like a razor blade. Are you admitting in front of multiple witnesses that your husband inputted a social security number that does not belong to him into a financial portal across state lines? We were co-signing. Thomas stammered, sweat visibly beading on his forehead. It was a verbal agreement. I did not ask about a verbal agreement, the judge snapped, shutting Thomas down instantly. I asked if you initiated a fraudulent wire transfer. Because the police sirens I currently hear approaching up the main driveway suggest that the federal banking authorities disagree with your definition of co-signing. The faint wail of approaching police sirens seeped through the heavy mahogany doors of the grand foyer. The automated bank fraud protocol had successfully dispatched local law enforcement. The reality of the situation crashed over Jamal. The man who had spent 2 years believing he was marrying into a respectable, wealthy family suddenly realized his entire relationship was built on a monumental financial house of cards. Jamal looked at the $80,000 venue, the thousands of imported white orchids, and the $15,000 dress Brittany was wearing. He connected the dots. The lavish gifts she had bought him, the expensive dinners she had insisted on hosting, the extravagant lifestyle she projected. It was all funded by crippling credit card debt and the systematic financial abuse of her older sister. He was not marrying a successful marketing executive. He was marrying a parasite. Jamal looked at Brittany one last time. The profound disappointment in his eyes was devastating. The unraveling of her lies was complete, leaving absolutely nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth exposed for everyone to see. Jamal took a deliberate step away from Brittany. The physical distance between them suddenly mirrored the massive emotional chasm that had just opened up. The air in the ballroom felt thick and suffocating under the harsh maintenance lights. The distant wail of police sirens grew louder, piercing through the thick stone walls of Oak Haven Estate. Jamal looked at his bride. He looked at the custom-beaded gown that cost more than a reliable vehicle. He looked at the perfectly styled hair and the flawless makeup that was now smeared with panic. Brittany Jamal said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm going to ask you one question. I need you to answer me with absolute honesty. Did you know your father stole your sister and her identity to pay for this wedding?" Brittany gasped, her hands flying to her chest in a theatrical display of shock. She looked at Thomas, then at Diane, and finally back to Jamal. Her eyes widened into large, watery pools of manufactured innocence. "No," she cried, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. "Jamal, baby, you have to believe me. I had no idea. My dad told me he handled the final payment. I thought he used his own bonus from work. I would never condone a crime. You know me. You know my heart." Jamal did not blink. He stared at her, his architectural mind analyzing the structural integrity of her defense. "If you did not know about the identity theft," Jamal countered slowly, "then why did you just tell Mr. Gideon that the owner of this venue gave you a family discount? You just claimed you had mutual friends in commercial real estate. But Mr. Gideon just revealed the owner is your own sister. The same sister you told me was a broke, struggling assistant. The same sister you banned from our rehearsal dinner because you said her poverty would make my parents uncomfortable." The trap clamped shut. Brittany realized her own conflicting lies had boxed her into a corner. She could not play the ignorant victim while simultaneously claiming she negotiated a luxury venue discount with an owner she pretended not to know. The panic in Brittany and her eyes hardened into something entirely different. The tears stopped falling. The vulnerability vanished. In its place, a vicious defensive anger flared up. She squared her shoulders and glared at Jamal. "You do not understand anything about my family," Brittany hissed, dropping the sweet, innocent bride persona entirely. "Cassidy is a jealous, bitter sister. She has always hated me. She has been insanely jealous of me since we were little kids because my parents actually loved me. She is miserable. She is completely alone. She has no husband, no friends, and no life. She probably bought this stupid venue just to lord it over us. She set this entire thing up to ruin my happiness because she cannot find a man who wants her." Jamal looked at her as if she had just sprouted a second head. "You are blaming your sister for your father committing wire fraud?" he asked, his tone laced with absolute disbelief. "She orchestrated this," Brittany shrieked, gesturing wildly around the sterile, brightly lit ballroom. "She could have just paid the bill quietly. She has millions of dollars sitting in her corporate accounts. But no, she had to make a massive public spectacle. She wanted to humiliate me in front of your family. She is a toxic, manipulative sociopath." "I am the victim here, Jamal. My own sister set a trap to destroy my wedding day. You are supposed to be on my side. You are supposed to protect me from her." Jamal slowly shook his head. His eyes swept over Brittany, taking in the manic energy, the lack of accountability, and the sheer breathtaking entitlement. "You are standing in a multi-million-dollar estate owned by the sister you called a failure," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. "Your father just admitted to trying to bribe a venue manager to cover up a felony. Your mother just begged me to overlook federal identity theft because it was a family arrangement. And your response to all of this is to call the victim of your family and their financial crimes a jealous, bitter woman." Brittany stamped her foot on the marble floor. "Yes," she screamed, "because she is. You do not know what she put me through growing up. She always made me feel stupid. She always acted like she was better than us just because she obsessed over her boring commercial real estate deals. I deserved this wedding, Jamal. I deserved a beautiful day. I have worked so hard to be the perfect partner for you. I bought you those expensive watches. I hosted those lavish dinners for your firm. I did everything right to fit into your world." Jamal stepped back again, as if her proximity was physically repulsive. "How did you pay for those watches, Brittany?" he asked, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "How did you pay for the dinners?" You told me you had a high-level marketing position. You told me you had a trust fund from your grandfather. But if your family has to steal an $80,000 credit line just to pay for a venue deposit, where did your money come from? The color drained from Brittany and her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jamal pressed forward his analytical mind, dismantling her entire reality. You do not have a trust fund. Do you? He demanded. You do not have a high-level marketing job. You have been lying to me since the day we met. Everything about you, the clothes, the gifts, the apartment downtown, it is all funded by debt. Or worse, it is funded by whatever else you and your parents have stolen from your sister over the years. That is not true, Diane interrupted, rushing forward to shield her daughter. Jamal, please, you are upsetting her. She is your bride. You love her. You cannot let one financial misunderstanding ruin your entire future together. Brittany loves you. We all love you. We are your family now. Jamal looked at Diane with a gaze so chilling it could have frozen water. You are not my family, he said with absolute finality. My family does not commit fraud. My family does not banish their own blood relatives to a folding chair in a hallway. My family builds things of actual value. You people just steal and destroy. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic wail. She reached out and grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his tailored tuxedo. You cannot do this to me, she sobbed, her fingers digging desperately into the expensive fabric. The police are coming. The guests are gone. You are all I have left. You promised to love me for better or for worse. This is the worst, Jamal. You have to stand by me. We can get through this. My dad will hire a good lawyer. We can sue Cassidy for emotional damages. We can still go on our honeymoon to Bora Bora tomorrow. Just hold me. Please just tell everyone you are on my side. Jamal looked down at her hands clutching his tuxedo. He did not look angry anymore. He looked profoundly exhausted and deeply sorrowful. He was looking at a complete stranger. The woman he thought he was marrying, the sophisticated, generous, loving partner, had never existed. She was a ghost, a carefully constructed mirage designed to trap him in a nightmare. Brittany continued to cry, begging him to validate her delusion completely, ignoring the flashing red and blue police lights that were now reflecting through the tall glass windows of the grand foyer. The sirens had stopped. The authorities had arrived at the front gates of Oakhaven Estate. The reckoning was no longer just a threat. It was parking in the valet circle. The strobing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness outside, casting frantic, colorful shadows against the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. Jamal stared at Brittany and her desperate, grasping hands, but before he could physically pry her fingers off his lapels, his mother intervened. The retired judge stepped squarely between her son and the woman who had tried to trap him. She moved with a formidable, chilling grace. She gently but firmly took her son by the forearm, pulling him a half-step backward. Then she turned her full, terrifying attention to Thomas, Diane, and Brittany. You seem to labor under the delusion that this is a domestic dispute, the judge said, her voice dropping into a register that commanded absolute silence. She looked at Diane, who was currently trembling near the altar, and then at Thomas, who was wiping a thick layer of sweat from his brow. You keep using the word family to shield yourselves from the consequences of your actions. But the law does not care about your biological ties. The law cares about the unauthorized use of a social security number to extract $80,000 across state banking lines. The law cares about wire fraud. Thomas opened his mouth, likely to repeat his pathetic co-signing defense, but the judge raised a single immaculate hand. Do not speak, she commanded. If you speak to me, you are making a statement to a former officer of the court while active law enforcement is walking up the driveway. I suggest you invoke your right to remain silent because you have already confessed to enough felonies tonight to secure a 5-year minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Identity theft is not a misunderstanding. It is a calculated predatory act. You targeted a high-net-worth individual, bypassed corporate security measures, and forged digital consent. The fact that the victim happens to be your own daughter only adds a layer of grotesque moral bankruptcy to your criminal charges. Brittany let go of Jamal and his tuxedo, shrinking back from the imposing matriarch. "But I did not do it," Brittany whined, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at her father. "He did the computer stuff. I just wanted a nice wedding. I am innocent." The judge looked at Brittany with profound clinical pity. "You are a co-conspirator," the judge corrected her smoothly. "You accepted goods and services secured by fraudulent means. You threatened a venue manager when confronted with the theft. You actively participated in the deception of my son by presenting stolen wealth as your own." Ignorance is not a defense when you are wearing a $15,000 dress paid for by stolen identity credentials. You built this entire spectacle on a foundation of theft, and you expect my son to legally bind himself to your criminal liability. That will never happen. The judge turned away from the trembling bride and addressed the left side of the aisle. The extended members of Jamal and his family had been standing by the rear exits, watching the confrontation with silent, dignified horror. They were doctors, engineers, professors, and civic leaders. They had worked their entire lives to build a legacy of excellence and integrity. They did not tolerate fraud, and they certainly did not associate with people who exploited their own children. "We are leaving," the judge announced to her family, her voice echoing clearly across the vast empty space of the ballroom. "Do not engage with these people. Do not speak to the authorities unless explicitly asked to provide a witness statement regarding the fraud admission we just heard. We have no ties to this family. We have no ties to this venue. We are walking out those doors, and we are never looking back." The response was instantaneous and perfectly synchronized. The groom and his family did not argue. They did not linger to watch the spectacle or hurl insults. Aunts, uncles, and cousins turned on their heels in unison and walked toward the grand foyer. They moved with a quiet, devastating dignity. There was no shouting, no chaotic pushing, and no frantic gathering of centerpieces. They simply exited the building, creating a mass exodus of the only respectable people who had attended the event. The sound of their coordinated footsteps on the imported Italian marble floor felt like a funeral march for Brittany and her social climbing ambitions. Diane watched the wealthy, prominent family march out the door, taking her dreams of country club bragging rights with them. She let out a strangled, desperate cry and chased after the judge. "Please wait!" Diane begged, her heels clicking frantically against the marble. "You cannot just leave us here. Jamal loves her. You are destroying my daughter and her future." The judge did not even break her stride. She did not turn her head to acknowledge the desperate woman trailing behind her. She simply kept walking toward the exit, guided by the venue security personnel who were ensuring their safe and swift departure. Diane stopped dead in her tracks, realizing she was shouting at the retreating backs of people who now viewed her as nothing more than a common criminal. The stark reality of her social annihilation crashed over her, leaving her gasping for air in the middle of the aisle. Jamal remained standing near the altar for one final moment. He watched his family exit the ballroom, securing their distance from the impending legal disaster. He watched the massive wooden doors close behind them, sealing off any possibility of reconciliation. He looked at the flashing red and blue lights painting the high windows of the estate. He looked at Thomas, who was now leaning heavily against a marble pillar, clutching his chest as the reality of his impending arrest set in. Then Jamal looked at Brittany. The woman who had spent 2 years pretending to be his perfect match was now just a terrified stranger in a ruined gown, standing amidst scattered white orchids and shattered lies. The entire groom side of the venue was now completely empty. The plush velvet chairs sat vacant under the harsh industrial maintenance lights. The silence in that half of the room was a heavy, suffocating reminder of everything Brittany had just lost. The prestige, the respect, and the affluent future she had tried to steal were walking out the front doors and climbing into their luxury sedans. They were driving away, leaving Brittany and her parents entirely alone to face the flashing police lights and the severe, unyielding consequences of their own spectacular greed. Jamal turned his attention back to the woman standing at the center of the ruined aisle. The silence pressing down on the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic sweeping of the police sirens, casting frantic red and blue shadows across the towering vaulted ceiling. He looked at Brittany, really looked at her, and saw past the meticulous bridal styling, past the shimmering fabric of her $15,000 gown, and straight into the dark void where her moral compass should have been. He had spent 2 years loving a phantom. He had believed in a woman who possessed a deep well of empathy, a woman who championed his architectural projects and shared his vision for a sustainable, equitable future. Now he realized that every supportive word she had ever spoken was a calculated investment toward securing this exact moment, standing in a stolen venue, wearing a stolen lifestyle, preparing to bind his pristine reputation to her family and their criminal enterprise. The realization was a physical weight on his chest. He felt sick. He felt violated. But above all else, he felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. Jamal raised his right hand to the lapel of his tailored black tuxedo. His fingers brushed against the delicate white orchid pinned to the expensive fabric. Brittany had selected the flower herself, claiming it represented pure, unadulterated devotion. The irony of that choice was staggering. He gripped the stem of the orchid and deliberately unpinned it from his jacket. He held the flower between his thumb and forefinger, examining it under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the industrial maintenance lights. The delicate petals already looked bruised and wilted, much like the elaborate fantasy she had constructed. Brittany watched his hands, her eyes widening in renewed terror. "Jamal, please," she begged, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper. "Please do not do this. You are angry. I understand that you are angry. But we can go to counseling. We can fix this. I will apologize to Cassidy. I will do whatever you want me to do. Just put the flower back on. Just tell them we are still getting married." Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet, absolute authority filled the empty space left by his departing family. "We are not getting married," Brittany Jamal stated, delivering the words with the precise, lethal impact of a wrecking ball. "The wedding is off. There is no counseling that can fix a federal felony. There is no apology that can erase the fact that you actively participated in the financial and emotional destruction of your own sister." "But I love you," Brittany wailed, taking a desperate step forward. The heavy layers of her custom gown dragged awkwardly against the imported marble. She reached out her acrylic nails, grasping at the empty air between them. "You are the love of my life. You promised me forever. You cannot throw away our entire relationship because my father made a stupid financial mistake." "It is not a mistake," Jamal corrected her sharply, his eyes flashing with righteous disgust. "A mistake is forgetting an appointment. Stealing $80,000 using stolen identity credentials is a calculated predatory crime. And it is not just your father. You stood right here and lied to my face. You claimed your sister was a struggling, bitter assistant when you knew she owned this entire estate. You banned her from our rehearsal dinner, you shoved her into a hallway next to the public restrooms, and then you smiled in my face and told me she just could not make it. You are a pathological liar, Brittany. You do not love me. You love my income, my status, and the social elevation my family could provide." Jamal looked down at the white orchid in his hand. He released his grip. The flower fell in slow motion, landing on the pristine marble floor with a soft, pathetic slap. He stepped over it, crushing the delicate petals beneath the heel of his polished leather shoe. He did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse. Jamal turned his back on Brittany, on Thomas, and on Diane. He walked down the center aisle with long, determined strides. He passed the blockade of security guards, offering a brief, respectful nod to Gideon as he went. He did not look back. He pushed through the heavy mahogany double doors, stepping out into the grand foyer, and walking directly toward the flashing lights of the police cruisers waiting in the valet circle. He was walking out of a nightmare and back into his real life. Brittany watched the broad shoulders of her former fiancé disappear through the doorway. The finality of his exit severed the last remaining thread, holding her reality together. The groom was gone. The affluent in-laws were gone. The 200 high society guests were gone. All that remained was the hollow echo of her own catastrophic greed. Her legs gave out. The physical and emotional exhaustion of maintaining a massive multi-year deception finally overwhelmed her nervous system. Brittany collapsed onto the floor, her knees hitting the hard marble with a brutal, echoing thud. The $15,000 custom-beaded gown, the ultimate symbol of her unearned vanity, swallowed her completely. The heavy layers of silk tulle and imported lace pooled around her on the cold ground, trapping her inside a cage of ruined fabric. She curled forward, pressing her forehead against the floor, and unleashed a sound that was less of a cry and more of an animalistic howl. It was the sound of a woman mourning the total annihilation of her future. A few feet away, Diane and Thomas stood completely paralyzed. They did not rush forward to comfort their golden child. They did not kneel beside her to offer empty reassurances. The survival instinct that governed their every action was fully consumed by the flashing red and blue lights reflecting through the estate windows. They could hear the heavy authoritative footsteps of law enforcement officers entering the grand foyer. The police had bypassed the valet stand and were making their way directly toward the ballroom. Thomas leaned his head back against a marble pillar, closing his eyes in defeat, while Diane simply stared at her weeping daughter with a vacant, terrified expression. They had sacrificed their eldest daughter to build an empire of dirt, and now the wind had finally blown it all away. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed against the imported marble of the grand foyer. The local authorities had not sent a single patrol car to casually investigate a noise complaint. They had dispatched 4 separate units. Identity theft involving a wire transfer of $80,000 triggered an immediate and severe federal banking response. The officers moved with coordinated purpose, their radios crackling with static that sliced through the heavy silence of the ruined ballroom. Thomas snapped his eyes open. The sheer volume of the approaching police presence broke through his paralysis. He pushed himself off the marble pillar, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He looked at Diane, who was still staring blankly at Brittany crying on the floor. He looked at Gideon, who stood perfectly still with his security detail waiting to point the authorities directly toward the bridal party. Thomas realized with blinding clarity that he was exactly 30 seconds away from being placed in handcuffs. He was about to be read his rights and dragged out of Oak Haven Estate in front of the valet staff, the catering crew, and whoever else remained on the property. The survival instinct of a lifelong con artist kicked in. Thomas did not stay to comfort his wife. He did not kneel to help his golden child up from the floor. He turned on his heel and bolted. He abandoned his family without a single backward glance, sprinting toward the narrow side corridor that connected the ballroom to the catering prep kitchens. He shoved past a bewildered waiter holding a tray of unused champagne flutes and burst through the heavy metal fire exit door. The cool autumn air hit his sweating face as he stumbled out onto the service driveway. He kept running, his custom tuxedo shoes crunching loudly against the gravel. He rounded the corner of the massive Tudor-style mansion, heading toward the main valet circle, where the police cruisers were parked, with their light bars flashing. He needed to find a way out, but more importantly, he needed to stop the federal banking protocol. There was only one person on the entire planet who possessed the authority to halt the investigation. I sat in the dark cabin of my Range Rover, parked discreetly near the edge of the property line. The engine was running silently. The climate control kept the interior perfectly comfortable. Through my tinted windshield, I had an unobstructed view of the flashing red and blue lights painting the stone facade of my estate. My encrypted laptop still displayed the security feeds showing the police officers currently entering the ballroom to question Diane and Brittany. My phone vibrated violently in the cup holder. I looked down at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed my father. He was calling me. The man who had forged my signature, stolen my credit, and banished me to a plastic folding chair was now calling me in a state of absolute unadulterated panic. I picked up the phone. I did not decline the call. I swiped the green button and raised the device to my ear. I wanted to hear the exact sound of his desperation. I wanted to hear the crumbling of his arrogant facade. Cassidy Thomas gasped into the receiver, his voice ragged and breathless. "Thank God you answered. Cassidy, you have to fix this right now." You have to call the bank. I leaned back against the leather headrest. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of emotion. Fix what, Dad? The police are here, Thomas hissed frantically. I could hear the crunch of gravel through the phone as he paced the driveway. They are walking into the ballroom right now. They are looking for me. You have to call your financial officer. You have to call the bank and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized the $80,000 transfer. Tell them I am an authorized user on your Crescent Holdings account. I looked out the windshield at the flashing police lights. Why would I lie to a federal banking institution? I asked smoothly. You are not an authorized user. You do not work for Crescent Holdings. You are a man who stole my social security number to pay for a wedding that just got canceled. Cassidy, please. Thomas begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. I am your father. You cannot send your own father to a federal penitentiary. I will pay you back. I swear to you. I will sell my car. I will take out a second mortgage on the house. I will give you every single penny of the $80,000 plus interest. Just pick up the phone and call off the police. If they arrest me tonight, my career is completely over. I will lose my job. I will lose my entire reputation. Your reputation was built on a foundation of lies, I reminded him calmly. You spent my entire life telling everyone I was a failure so you could elevate Brittany. You drained my college fund to buy her a car, and you expected me to stay silent. You thought you could steal my identity today because you assumed I was still the weak, compliant daughter who would just absorb your abuse to keep the peace. You miscalculated. It was a loan, Thomas yelled, desperation making him aggressive. We are family. Families borrow money from each other. You have millions of dollars sitting in corporate accounts. You own this entire massive estate. $80,000 is pocket change to you. You are being vindictive and cruel over pocket change. You are destroying your sister and her future because you are jealous. I am destroying nothing, I replied softly, watching an officer finally spot him. You destroyed yourselves. Have fun explaining your financial transactions to the authorities. Thomas let out a choked, desperate sound. Cassidy, wait, do not hang up. You have to listen. I am begging you. I will do whatever you want. I will apologize in front of everyone. Call the fraud department. Tell them it was an authorized family expense. Tell them you gave me permission to use your social security number. They will listen to you. You are the chief executive officer. You have the power to stop this before they put me in handcuffs. I cannot go to jail, Cassidy. Please just make the phone call. I kept my eyes locked on my father, pacing frantically near the edge of the service driveway. A police officer was walking briskly toward him, a bright tactical flashlight sweeping across the gravel. Dad, I said, my voice cutting through his panicked rambling with absolute clinical precision. You fundamentally misunderstand how the financial system operates. You seem to think a federal felony is like a disputed charge at a local department store. You think I can simply call customer service and ask them to cancel a police dispatch. It does not work that way. When you initiated an $80,000 wire transfer using my stolen identity credentials, you did not just steal from Crescent Holdings. You defrauded a federally insured banking institution. But the money is yours, Thomas argued, his voice pitching higher as the beam of the police flashlight caught his custom tuxedo shoes. You are the primary account holder. If the account holder says the transaction is valid, the bank has to drop the investigation. That is how the law works, Cassidy. You are just being stubborn to punish us. You are trying to ruin our lives over a simple misunderstanding. You always overreact to everything. That is exactly not how the law works, I corrected him, feeling a deep, satisfying calm settle over my body. I am not the only victim here. The bank is the primary victim of wire fraud. The moment my chief financial officer flagged the transfer as a synthetic identity bypass, the bank automated security protocol was permanently triggered. They notified the authorities because you utilized interstate communication lines to commit financial theft. That elevates your family favor to a severe federal crime. Even if I wanted to call them and lie on your behalf, which I absolutely do not intend to do, the bank would still pursue criminal charges. They have your digital footprint. They have the precise IP address of the device you used. They have the exact timestamp of when you inputted my social security number into the payment portal. You left a trail of electronic evidence a mile wide because you are arrogant and thought you were untouchable. Thomas let out a ragged, heavy sob. It was a pathetic, hollow sound echoing through the receiver. I did it for your sister, he cried, attempting to pivot back to his usual emotional manipulation. Brittany was falling apart. The vendors were threatening to cancel everything. Jamal and his prominent family were expecting a certain level of luxury today. We had to keep up appearances. We had to make sure she secured the marriage into that social circle. You know exactly how important this was for her future. You are her sister Cassidy. You are supposed to protect her. I am supposed to protect her. I repeated the sheer absurdity of the statement vibrating in the quiet cabin of my vehicle. You stole my identity, forged my signature, and risked my corporate reputation to protect a pathetic lie. You built a massive house of cards and expected me to act as the structural support. You banished me to a plastic folding chair next to a public restroom while spending $80,000 of my own hard-earned money to feed your endless ego. I am not protecting Brittany. I am not protecting you. I am protecting the commercial real estate empire I built with my own two hands while you were busy telling everyone I was a total failure. You are a monster, Thomas hissed, his fear rapidly transforming back into toxic familiar rage. You planned this whole trap. You sat there in your cheap dress and let us walk right into a slaughterhouse. You wanted to see us destroyed in front of Jamal and his parents. You wanted to ruin your mother and her social standing. I did not force you to commit a felony. I replied, my voice remaining perfectly level. I did not force you to steal my social security number. I simply refused to be your victim anymore. You walked into this trap entirely on your own. You let your greed and your crippling insecurity dictate your actions. Now you get to experience the real consequences of breaking federal law. The police officer had reached him now. I could see the uniformed officer placing a firm, commanding hand on Thomas and his shoulder. Through the phone, I heard the muffled, authoritative voice of the officer asking my father to confirm his identity. Thomas dropped the phone from his ear but did not end the active call. I listened intently to the audio feed of his downfall. Yes, I am Thomas. My father stammered to the officer, his voice trembling so violently I could barely recognize it. But there has been a massive, terrible mistake here tonight. I am the father of the bride. I am hosting this exclusive event. You need to go inside and speak to the venue manager immediately. I am an important man in this community. Sir, the police officer stated clearly, the phone audio capturing every single crisp syllable. We have a confirmed report of felony identity theft and wire fraud originating from this location. The suspect profile matches your physical description perfectly, and we have been instructed by federal banking authorities to detain you for questioning regarding an $80,000 unauthorized electronic transfer. Please turn around and place your hands securely behind your back right now. I heard the distinct metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting shut over the open phone line. A sharp gasp escaped Thomas. The phone clattered against the gravel of the service driveway, the impact producing a loud, static crunch before the audio feed cut out entirely. I lowered my device, the screen going dark in the palm of my hand. Through the tinted windshield of my Range Rover, I watched the officer physically guide my father toward the back of the flashing cruiser. Thomas stumbled, his custom-tailored tuxedo pants catching on the rough stones. He looked completely broken, his shoulders slumped forward, the arrogant posture he had weaponized for decades entirely gone. He was no longer the imposing patriarch of a wealthy family, orchestrating a high society event. He was just a terrified man facing a federal felony charge that carried a mandatory minimum sentence. I opened my laptop to check the interior security feeds one last time. Several police officers had already bypassed the grand foyer and entered the main ballroom. The harsh fluorescent maintenance lights illuminated their dark uniforms, creating a jarring contrast against the imported marble floors and the cascading white orchids. Diane was backed against a decorative stone pillar, clutching her expensive evening bag, as two officers approached her. I zoomed in on the camera angle. I could not hear the audio inside the hall, but Diane and her frantic body language painted a vivid picture. She was shaking her head violently, waving her hands in the air, pointing frantically toward the exits as if trying to blame the fleeing guests. She attempted her usual manipulative tactics, crying and putting a hand over her heart to play the fragile, misunderstood victim. The officers did not buy her performance. They stood with their notepads open, their postures rigid and unyielding. One officer held up a clear plastic evidence bag containing a printed copy of the forged venue contract Gideon had handed them. Diane stared at the document, her mouth falling open in a silent scream. She realized the paper trail was absolute. She realized her husband had just been detained outside and was currently sitting in the back of a police vehicle. The grand illusion she had sacrificed her eldest daughter to build was officially dead. She sagged against the cold stone pillar, her manicured hands covering her face, as the officers continued their relentless questioning, demanding answers about her involvement in the unauthorized bank transfer. There was no country club friend to save her, no high society connection to bail her out, and no prominent architect groom to elevate her social status. She was entirely at the mercy of the legal system she had arrogantly assumed she could easily outsmart. My eyes drifted to the center of the ballroom. Brittany was still sitting on the cold marble floor. The 200 velvet-backed chairs surrounding her were completely empty. The prestigious guests had vanished. Jamal had walked out. Her parents were currently being interrogated by federal authorities. She was entirely alone. The $15,000 custom-beaded gown she wore had become a heavy, suffocating cage. The intricate lace and shimmering fabric looked absurd under the brutal, unforgiving glare of the industrial cleaning lights. She hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. The golden child, the sister who had demanded I sit on a plastic folding chair next to the public restrooms to protect her aesthetic, was now sitting in the ruins of her own catastrophic vanity. There was no anger left in me as I watched her. There was no vindictive joy, no burning need for revenge. I felt a profound, echoing emptiness that quickly gave way to a deep, cleansing peace. For 33 years, I had allowed these people to dictate my worth. I had internalized their constant criticism, accepted their blatant disrespect, and convinced myself that tolerating their abuse was the price of family loyalty. I had built a massive commercial real estate empire, yet I had still let them make me feel small. That cycle ended tonight. They had dug their own graves with their unyielding greed, and I had simply refused to jump into the dirt with them. I had finally drawn a boundary written in federal law, and they had chosen to cross it willingly. I reached forward and closed the laptop. The screen snapped shut, plunging the cabin of my vehicle back into comfortable darkness. I placed the computer carefully on the passenger seat. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool autumn air fill my lungs. The scent of pine needles and damp earth filtered through the ventilation system, replacing the lingering memory of the stifling bridal suite. The heavy, crushing weight of familial obligation that had anchored me to the ground for my entire life was finally lifted. I reached out and pressed the ignition button on the dashboard. The powerful engine of the Range Rover roared to life, a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the steering wheel and into my hands. I shifted the vehicle into drive. I did not look back at the grand Tudor-style facade of Oakhaven Estate. I did not glance at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the stone walls. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the long, winding driveway ahead. I eased my foot onto the accelerator. The tires gripped the asphalt, propelling the heavy vehicle forward into the night. The security gates of the estate automatically swung open as my vehicle approached, granting me unrestricted passage out of the property. I drove past the manicured lawns, past the towering oak trees, and merged onto the quiet country highway that led back to the city. The absolute darkness enveloped the car, but the road ahead was perfectly illuminated by my bright headlights cutting through the night. I left the flashing sirens, the ruined custom gown, the shattered wedding dreams, and the federal fraud investigation far behind me. I was completely free. 6 months passed since that night at Oakhaven Estate. The crisp autumn air had surrendered to a harsh, bitter winter and eventually thawed into a bright, promising spring. For the first time in my 33 years of life, I experienced a season entirely devoid of family-induced anxiety. My commercial real estate portfolio expanded by 20%, and Crescent Holdings acquired 3 new premium properties across the eastern seaboard. I was thriving in the absolute quiet that followed the storm. I did not receive panicked phone calls demanding money. I did not attend forced holiday dinners where my career was mocked. I simply existed in a state of profound, uninterrupted peace. The heavy, crushing weight of familial obligation was gone, leaving me free to channel all my energy into my business and my own well-being. My corporate legal team handled all communication regarding the criminal fallout. I refused to speak to any of my relatives directly. David, my chief financial officer, provided me with sterile factual updates during our weekly briefings. The legal consequences for Thomas and Diane were swift and brutally absolute. The federal prosecutors did not care about their country club memberships or their polished suburban image. The justice system cared only about the electronic trail of identity theft and the unauthorized $80,000 wire transfer that crossed state banking lines. Faced with the undeniable evidence of their own digital footprints and the terrifying prospect of serving a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary, they had no choice but to take a plea deal. They were backed into a corner entirely of their own making. Thomas and Diane formally pled guilty to felony wire fraud and identity theft. The judge who presided over their sentencing hearing was completely unmoved by Diane and her performative tears in the courtroom. They managed to avoid active prison time due to their lack of prior criminal records, but the judicial leniency ended there. Both of my parents were sentenced to 5 years of strict federal probation. They were required to surrender their passports immediately, preventing any future attempts to flee or project a jet-setting lifestyle. They were subjected to strict curfews and mandatory community service. Furthermore, they were forced to submit to regular intrusive financial audits by a court-appointed supervisor. The severe restrictions completely suffocated their desperate need to appear affluent. They were now legally documented felons living under the microscope of the federal government. The financial devastation was even more severe. The court ordered full and immediate restitution to Crescent Holdings alongside staggering legal fines. To satisfy the federal mandate and pay their exorbitant defense attorneys, Thomas and Diane were forced into complete financial liquidation. The carefully curated empire of dirt they had built on maxed-out credit cards and refinanced mortgages completely collapsed overnight. They had to sell their sprawling 4-bedroom suburban home at a significant loss just to cover the immediate legal debts. They were forced to auction off their luxury leased vehicles, replacing them with a single unreliable used sedan. Diane had to swallow her massive pride and liquidate her expensive jewelry and designer handbags through online consignment shops. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city in a neighborhood they previously would have mocked relentlessly. Thomas lost his comfortable executive position the exact moment his corporate firm discovered the felony conviction on his record. He was currently working as a mid-level consultant for a fraction of his former salary, struggling to make ends meet. Their social annihilation was absolute and irreversible. Their former affluent friends stopped returning their calls, and they were quietly but firmly expelled from their exclusive social clubs. They became pariahs in their own community, isolated by their toxic greed. As for the groom, Jamal executed his exit strategy with the same architectural precision he applied to his award-winning buildings. Because he and Brittany had filed their preliminary marriage license at the courthouse a few days prior to the ruined ceremony, he required legal intervention to sever the tie permanently. Jamal hired a top-tier family law attorney and filed for an immediate annulment on the grounds of egregious fraud. He cited Brittany and her active complicity in a criminal enterprise, and her gross misrepresentation of her financial and familial reality. He presented text messages and witness statements proving she had lied about her identity, her wealth, and her family dynamics to trap him into a legally binding union. The presiding judge granted the annulment in record time, completely dissolving the marriage as if it had never existed. Jamal did not even ask for his expensive diamond engagement ring back. He simply had his lawyers deliver a ruthless cease and desist order to Brittany, preventing her from ever contacting him, his parents, or his extended family again. He walked away from the smoldering wreckage with his dignity and his pristine professional reputation entirely intact. His architectural firm recently won a massive lucrative contract to design a new sustainable wing for a local university. He survived his collision with my toxic family and emerged completely unscathed, moving forward into a bright, successful future. When the $80,000 restitution check finally cleared my corporate accounts, I felt no triumphant thrill. I simply instructed David to donate the entire sum to a local charity that provided financial literacy and housing support for young women escaping abusive households. I did not need their tainted money to survive. I had built my fortune on my own merit and hard work. The return of the stolen funds was just a clerical footnote in the monthly ledger of Crescent Holdings. My parents had sacrificed everything they claimed to value just to fund a fraudulent illusion. They had burned their own lives to the ground while trying to keep me hidden in the shadows. Now they were living in the ashes, while I continued to build my empire in the light. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my corner office at Crescent Holdings. I stood on the top floor of a downtown high-rise overlooking the sprawling skyline of the city. The view was breathtaking, a daily reminder of exactly how far I had climbed, using nothing but my own grit and determination. My office was a sanctuary of minimalist design featuring sleek mahogany furniture, polished concrete floors, and modern artwork that I had curated myself. There were no plastic folding chairs here. There were only genuine leather executive seats, reserved for people who had earned their place at the table. I took a sip of my black coffee, reviewing the final profit margins for the Oakhaven Estate quarter. The venue was booked solid for the next 2 years with legitimate clients who paid their invoices using their own legally acquired funds. The intercom on my desk buzzed with a soft melodic chime. I pressed the button to connect with my executive assistant. "Yes," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the bustling city streets far below. Cassidy, my assistant, reported, her voice carrying a hint of cautious hesitation. "I apologize for the interruption. There is a woman in the ground floor reception area requesting to speak with you. She does not have an appointment. She says her name is Brittany and insists it is an urgent family matter. Security is standing by to escort her off the premises. Would you like me to authorize her removal?" I lowered my coffee mug to the mahogany desk. For a fraction of a second, the old familiar tension threatened to tighten my shoulders. But the feeling evaporated instantly, replaced by the cool, clinical detachment I had cultivated over the past 6 months. Brittany had absolutely no power here. She was just a stranger walking into a corporate fortress she could never comprehend. "Send her up," I instructed calmly. "Give her exactly 5 minutes of my schedule." A few moments later, the heavy glass door to my office opened. Brittany stepped inside. The transformation was so jarring it almost defied logic. The golden child who had demanded a $120,000 wedding venue was completely gone. In her place stood a thoroughly defeated 29-year-old woman carrying the visible weight of total financial and social ruin. She was not wearing custom beaded silk or imported lace. She wore a faded gray retail uniform polo shirt and cheap scuffed sneakers. Her blonde hair, once perfectly styled by expensive salon professionals, was pulled back into a messy, uneven ponytail. The heavy designer makeup was gone, revealing dark, exhausted circles under her eyes and a pale, sallow complexion. She looked small, ordinary, and profoundly exhausted. Brittany stopped a few feet away from my desk. She looked around the expansive corner office, her eyes widening as she took in the undeniable proof of my massive success. The reality of what she had thrown away to maintain her petty delusions finally seemed to crash down on her all at once. "Cassidy," Brittany began, her voice cracking instantly. It sounded thin and weak, completely stripped of the arrogant nasal entitlement that had defined our entire childhood. I know I have no right to be here. I know what I did was unforgivable. I did not offer her a seat. I simply remained standing behind my desk, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. Your 5 minutes started the moment you walked through that door, Brittany. State your business. She flinched at my cold, professional tone. She wrung her hands together, staring down at her scuffed retail shoes. I lost everything, Cassidy. Jamal blocked my number and finalized the annulment. My friends from the country club blocked me on all social media platforms. Mom and Dad are facing eviction again because Dad cannot find a job that pays enough to cover their court-mandated restitution. I am working 40 hours a week managing a cash register at a discount clothing store just to pay off the massive debt from the wedding vendors who sued me for breach of contract. I am drowning. I looked at her with absolute neutrality. You are describing the natural consequences of federal wire fraud and systemic pathological lying. You built a life on stolen money and stolen identities. The foundation collapsed. That is basic physics, not a tragedy. Please, Brittany begged, finally looking up to meet my eyes. Tears welled up, spilling over her lashes and tracking down her pale cheeks. I am not asking for a handout. I am asking for a job. I know Crescent Holdings owns dozens of properties. I know you employ hundreds of people. I will do anything. I will work in the mailroom. I will scrub floors at Oak Haven Estate. I just need a chance to start over. I need my big sister to help me survive. I studied her tear-streaked face. I saw the desperation. I saw the crushing reality of a woman who had never developed a single marketable skill because she had spent her entire life relying on manipulation and our parents' enabling behavior. But I also saw the woman who had smirked at me in a hallway while banishing me to sit next to a toilet. I saw the woman who had screamed that I was a bitter, jealous failure while wearing a dress paid for by my stolen social security number. You do not want a fresh start, Brittany, I replied, my voice echoing with finality. You want a rescue. You want me to absorb the consequences of your actions just like Mom and Dad always did. But I am not your safety net. I am the chief executive officer of a commercial real estate empire. I do not hire individuals who pose active liabilities to my corporate infrastructure. Your presence in my company would be a direct threat to my financial security. Brittany let out a choked, desperate sob. Cassidy, please. We are family. We share genetics, I corrected her smoothly. Family is built on mutual respect, protection, and trust. You destroyed all three. You made your choices with absolute malicious clarity. Now you must live the rest of your life experiencing the reality of those choices. I reached out and pressed the intercom button on my desk. Security, I said clearly. My guest is ready to be escorted out of the building. Brittany stood frozen. She realized the door was permanently closed. There would be no dramatic reconciliation. There would be no unearned forgiveness. There would be no financial bailout. She turned around slowly, her shoulders slumping in total defeat, and walked out of my office alongside the arriving security guard. She disappeared down the hallway, fading back into the obscure, ordinary life she had earned. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city once more. The sunlight warmed my face. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute peace. The toxicity was completely excised from my life. The empire I built was safe, secure, and entirely my own. I had protected my peace with iron boundaries, and I was finally free to enjoy the beautiful, independent life I had forged in the fire. People often say blood is thicker than water. But sometimes the very people who share your blood are the first ones to push you into the mud. They will drain your resources, sabotage your peace, and expect you to smile while they do it. Have you ever had to coldly sign papers bringing your own family to court to protect yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that respect is not naturally given, it must be protected by iron boundaries. The story of Cassidy and her family's astonishing betrayal teaches a profound and difficult lesson. Sharing DNA with someone does not automatically entitle them to your resources, your peace, or your presence. For too long, society has pushed the narrative that family is everything, often weaponizing this sentiment to force individuals to endure toxic, manipulative, and even criminal behavior. Cassidy's journey shatters this dangerous illusion. When Brittany and her parents stole Cassidy's identity to fund a lavish wedding, they didn't just cross a legal line. They proved that their love was entirely conditional and exploitative. The critical takeaway here is the absolute necessity of establishing ironclad boundaries. Cassidy didn't scream, throw a tantrum, or seek petty vengeance when relegated to a plastic folding chair in the hallway. Instead, she let the cold, hard consequences of reality and the law do the talking. She removed herself from the role of the victim and stepped into her power as an independent, self-made woman. Often we tolerate disrespect from relatives that we would never accept from strangers simply because of a shared last name. However, true family is defined by mutual respect, trust, and protection. When those elements are absent, walking away is not an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Cassidy's refusal to bail her sister out of the resulting ruin demonstrates that shielding toxic people from the consequences of their actions only enables their abuse. We must learn to protect our energy and our empires from anyone who attempts to tear them down, regardless of who they are. If you find yourself constantly drained by the people who are supposed to love you most, take a step back today and evaluate whether it is time to build your own unshakable boundaries.